行了。 everybody 6:05, so we have 6:04, so I think it's a good time to start this evening's proceedings. First, I'd like to thank everybody who came out tonight. It was absolutely stunning day. I was outside for maybe 2 or 3 minutes today, so hopefully you got an opportunity to spend a little bit of time outside and steal one of these summer days from the fall. My name is Jamie Rabbit. I'm the Director of Planning, and I'd like to again welcome you here tonight. This is our third meeting in a series of 4. We started meetings at South Road School, where we explored development potentials there for workforce housing. We had a meeting last week associated with the Wakefield Elementary School, and that meeting was held here. This is again our third meeting, which is to discuss the Oliver Watson property on Waits Corner Road. And before we get into our full presentation, I'd like to recognize a few people who are in the room. We have Councilman Mike Marin in the back of the room. We have Councilman Greg Sweet. We also have Brian Wagner, our staff from the Planning Department, Deputy Town Manager Luke Murray is also here. We have Jeremy Lake from Union Studios and Eric Bush from Pagrini Group. And they'll be doing the heavy lift as it relates to the presentation tonight. Again, we're looking at conceptual plans for the development of workforce housing on 3 town-controlled properties. These are concepts. They're not full design. They haven't been completely vetted on the financial side, engineering side. These are potentially what can fit on 3 sites within town, and specific tonight to Oliver Watson. Again, that's my brief introduction today. Jim Manny gives his humble apologies for not being able to attend tonight. He is away on much-deserved time off. He will be returning this weekend. He will be at a council meeting Monday, where he will give an update on the status of a number of projects in town as it relates to planning and development. I'd like to turn it over to Luke Murray for a brief background on where we are, where we've been going, and some information regarding the Oliver Watson property. So, Luke.
Thank you, Jamie. So I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. This is an important effort. I see a lot of familiar faces, either those who attend town council meetings or have attended the meeting so far. So obviously this is an important issue to you, and it's a broader community issue. Just so everyone understands that this is a priority of the South Kingstown Town Council. And so they've charged the administration with looking specifically at options for affordable housing, workforce-style housing on these town-owned sites, as Jamie said. So tonight we're really talking, and tonight we're relegating it to the discussion of the Oliver Watson property. So I would ask that people really keep it to that subject matter topic. I know there may be other ideas, and we will get those ideas further into the process. But right now, the mission and goals of the administration is to solicit that input and give that feedback back to council. So when we get to the end of this process, we hope to have consolidated input for their consideration and further action. That further action may take many shapes and forms. This is step 1 of probably a 30-step process. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind, because it'll be a long road, but it's one that we want to do in collaboration with the community. As Jamie said, this is the 3rd of 4 meetings. We'll have 1 more meeting specifically for boards and commissions. So those who are here that serve on a board or commission will have a distinct opportunity to get a presentation, collaborate with your own groups, and then we have a standard form that we're creating, so there's consistent feedback from those groups, both on the affordable housing concepts for each one of these sites, but in addition, there'll be an open comment so you can provide suggestions on whatever. If you feel like the group sees a different use for the site, or you have alternative suggestions, you will be afforded that opportunity. So I ask everyone to just be patient and work the process. We've allowed for that to happen. Just a little bit on a history on the Oliver Watson site, because, you know, obviously this is This even predates the South Road Elementary School property, if you can imagine, as far as being something that's been outstanding and in the public domain. We've seen these properties sit. Some of you may not even know that this property existed. But in 1939, Mary Watson had deeded this property over to the town for quote-unquote a home for the aged. So essentially senior housing for the town. And it operated that way up until approximately 1997, at which point it closed. I don't know the details of why it closed. It predated me. I could certainly get those specifics, but it did close. And it sat idle for a few years, and I'm sure there may be some in here who know why. It sat idle for a few years. And until the town took action, and there was that restriction on there, it had to be used for a specific purpose. The town went to court at that time and got a Superior Court judgment to relieve us of that restriction to sell the property or do with it as we may. So we're essentially unrestricted at this point on the property. And I won't get into the legal specifics of that. I certainly have a full write-up on it that I've briefed the council on and has been a point of discussion. But the important thing to know is that since 2000, this property has been looked at multiple times. It's been looked at through the affordable housing lens. It's been looked at through the lens of just providing housing in general, reuse of the property, but nothing really has occurred. And so now the house has been sitting for another 20, almost 25 years, and idle. And we're at a point, everyone knows that affordable housing and workforce housing in our community is a major topic and issue. So the council, knowing this and having other properties available, wanted to take a comprehensive look at all of the properties and really consider this one in the totality of what we have in inventory. So this site's unique. It's situated in West Kingston. It is a rural area. We know that, surrounded by turf farms and rural housing. It does provide good access from Waits Quarter Road. It's approximately, remind me, 2.5 acres? 2.7 acres. So you'll see some concepts tonight that I think Jeremy will run through, and we'll have a great presentation for you. I encourage you to ask questions. I encourage you to participate. I encourage you to lend your ideas and wherever you sit with regards to housing in general. But I want to be clear on something, because the last meeting, this topic came up about the word affordable. When we talk about affordable, and Jeremy and Eric will talk a little bit more about this, this is housing for people who are working in our community, who are in retail industry, service industry, government workers. There are people in the community who are average income earners who can't afford housing right now. We're not really talking about public housing. When you think about South Kingstown Housing Authority, they fulfill a certain need from 30 to 60% AMI, which that will be reviewed with you. We're really looking for what's called the missing middle, 60 up to 120. And you'll see in your sheets what that looks like, and that will be reviewed with you. So I just want to address that right out of the gate. So when we talk about this housing, we're talking truly about workforce housing. That sounds like a better term, but that's the truthful term for it. It's people who are in that missing middle. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy for his presentation.
All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Jeremy Lake with Union Studio. Again, we just wanted to highlight that tonight's meeting is a chance for us to just get your opinions on these concepts, okay? These are just, let's call them cartoons that we threw on the wall so we'd have something to sort of throw darts at and have a conversation. We want you to ask questions, but please understand the idea isn't that we're going to vote at the end of this which one of the four and then we're going to build it tomorrow, right? This is just the beginning of a process, but it's always helpful to have something up to talk about. And again, as mentioned, this is the third of 4 meetings that are sort of these initial feedback sessions. We'll end up reviewing what we hear with the town council probably sometime in October. But again, this is all just sort of jump-starting a process that will go on for a ways after this point in time. So who is Union? Who do I work for? We were founded in 2001. We are an architecture and community design practice. We are 36 employees strong. Our primary office is in Providence, Rhode Island, but we also have a smaller office in Philadelphia. Our mission is to use the power of design to enrich lives and strengthen communities. And we work on a broad range of projects. We work on primarily housing, but we do mixed use, institutional. We've done libraries, hotels. We've done a number of things. Most of it in New England, a lot of it in Rhode Island, but we do work around the country. And in particular, I wanted to highlight that we also have a lot of projects that fall in this sort of either affordable or sort of workforce spectrum, which is what we're talking about tonight. And how that gets done, there's a variety of ways that can get done, and we've worked on a number of those types of projects. So, for example, the upper left-hand project shown here is Sweetbriar. This is a project where everyone there, it's a deed-restricted community, 30 to 60% of area median income. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here tonight. But a lot of the principles of creating common open space homes that people are really proud in, those are the kinds of things we apply kind of to any price point, any type of housing we'd work on. So one approach is tax credits. That's what that's all about. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here today. The upper right-hand corner is a different strategy, might be a little bit more applicable here. This is a project called Brewster Landing, which is in Brewster, Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a program called 40B. Rhode Island has a similar thing, which is called a comp plan permit. The idea is that you might give a private developer a little more leeway on things like density and some of the ways that they build out a community, with the trade-off being that they will provide 25% of the homes as deed restricted at some level, often like 80% AMI. So that's more like the workforce we're talking about. So they'll sell 3/4 of the units at full market rate, and those are meant to sort of offset the cost of the 25% that are being sold at basically a discounted rate to provide that housing. So that might be a model that we consider here, for instance. The lower right-hand corner is a project of ours in East Greenwich called Cottages on Green. And in this case, nothing is deed restricted, but the idea is that by doing very sort of compact design with very efficient homes on consolidated on a small parcel, we can bring down some of the costs that you might expect. The land costs, the approval costs are spread out over more units. And by doing so, you can just bring down the initial price point. So it's what we might call attainable housing. The idea is just how do we lower that initial cost of entry so that more people can afford those homes? So my point is there's a broad spectrum of ways you can try to solve for this issue. None of them are easy. None of them are straightforward. They're all very complicated, and that's one of the things we'll get through. But it all starts with what is the community, what is the vision for that place, and then how do you make the financing work? But the financing also informs the vision. We don't start out, you'll see we didn't start by just drawing one house on the site. We know that would never work out. That doesn't pencil out as an attainable home, a workforce home. So those things are all meant to inform this process. And then the last thing I'll just point out, the lower left-hand corner, that's the recently completed Pine View Apartments over in Exeter. And the idea is that that's just a different building type. In this case, both of those structures look like a big single-family home, but they actually have 4 units in them. So those might be 1-bedroom apartments or 2-bedroom apartments, but done in a way that it looks like a single-family home. We're going to kind of come back to this concept at one point so that it still fits into a community like West Kingston. Even though it's technically the density might be a little bit higher, the idea is that it's a different unit type than what might be there currently to provide options that don't currently exist. I also wanted to share that we have done and continue to do a lot of work in South Kingstown. We're up in Providence, but I make the drive down here quite a bit. One really appropriate project that we wanted to talk about was a couple of years ago. We actually did a report working with the town, going to the historic villages like West Kingston, like Wakefield, like Peacedale, finding some of the examples of housing types that aren't just a single-family home or a big apartment building. There's all these things in between, like cottages, townhouses, duplexes, that we used to build a lot more of. We haven't built as many sort of since World War II, in large part because we tried to really simplify our zoning down to being single-family homes or big apartment buildings. But there's a lot of great historic examples that are from this place, from this town, that we would reference when thinking about this sort of an exercise. And we were fortunate to be able to kind of do that. This was like our homework, right? This gave us the mindset, some of the things that we could find locally as good examples. And in fact, that work, part of the, what came of that work was actually helping write the cottage ordinance that's currently in place now in town. So there is an ordinance where you can propose a cottage community up to 8 units to an acre with a number of metrics. And those metrics we based on the things that we were seeing when we walked around Peacedale, when we walked around West Kingston, when we walked around Matunic. We tried to fine tune that so it would feel appropriate to this place. And last but not least, I also did want to share that we are currently working with the South Kingstown Housing Authority on the redevelopment of Champaign Heights. And so this is we're very much working in this realm. This would be sort of the more deed-restricted affordable housing. But again, a lot of the principles here about common green spaces, front porches, architecture that looks like it belongs here. It didn't just sort of land from some other place. These are all principles that we apply, again, no matter where we are on that spectrum of cost. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Eric to introduce himself.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good evening, everybody. My name is Eric Bush. I'm a managing partner for a firm called the Peregrine Group. We're also Rhode Island-based and work a lot with Union Studios, based in East Providence. And what we do and what our role is here is we are basically development or real estate consultants. So doing financing, doing planning, project management, really the full life cycle from early on in the process like this, to all the way through, and actually when buildings are complete, even staying on and as managing those assets once they're complete. So we like to think we have the full kind of spectrum of development and can bring that lens of, okay, if there's some plans that start to really come together here, we can apply some numbers to them, start to look at some of the risks or hurdles that might come up in a development process, and really kind of as a sidecar along with Jeremy and his team, be able to add a little bit more breadth to that lens and say it's not just design, but we want to think about all these other things, the budgeting, the financing, the potential capital structure, public-private partnerships, all these things that we deal with every day, and can help hopefully inform a plan and make it more implementable. So.
All right, so the existing house, I think Luke did a good job of sort of introducing, the existing house. You guys are, I'm sure, familiar with it. But it was built in 1880, roughly 2,800 square feet, a 2.7 acre lot. There are a couple outbuildings out back. We didn't go inside of those. From the outside, it was clear they were in pretty tough shape. And he already mentioned how, there's a complicated history here. But again, this is something that the town owns, that the town has available to them. And currently, it's just sort of sitting underutilized. These are some of the things that we wanted to be clear from the get-go as well, that we're going to show you a number of concepts here, but there are a lot of decisions yet to be made. There's a lot of variables that are still very much at play, and I think those are some of the things that we're hoping to get a little bit of feedback from you guys on. So for instance, the number of types of units that we're showing on the site. There are a number of ways we could think about doing this. We weren't given sort of you must show 16 units. We were actually tasked with just come up with some schemes that you think make sense based on your experience working on these sorts of projects that would be hopefully a feasible project ultimately. And so that's what we've done, but we want to get your feedback on that. We're not sure if the units would be for sale, for rent, or some combination. Again, that's a complication around the financing, et cetera. But again, it could steer one way or the other depending on what the community ultimately thinks is the right solution here. What percentage are affordable versus market rate? As I mentioned, there's a number of different models for how this gets delivered. Maybe there's a model where some percentage are at just sort of unrestricted market rate and some have some kind of restriction or way of getting the prices at a different point. Will the land be retained by the town or sold off to a potential development partner? To be determined. What are the impacts to traffic, schools, town services, et cetera? Those are all important things that in due course will certainly be studied, and a project won't move forward unless those things can be done feasibly. But we have confidence that the kind of thing we're proposing there would be solutions for those things. And something that's come up in some of the other meetings, I don't know how much of an issue it is necessarily for this particular site, but what sort of restrictions might we consider to prevent short-term rentals? I know there's a real concern that people come in and either buy these as summer homes, then rent them out as Airbnbs the rest of the season, or buy them so that students can rent them out or use them. And I know some members of the community and some of the other sites that we were looking at, there was a real concern that you weren't having sort of full-time, year-round residents moving into these communities. That's kind of what the whole goal and point of this is, right? How do we make these homes for the local workforce? So what sort of things might we consider when we're thinking about those challenges? I think I pass it back to you here.
So at this point, and before we kind of get into some of those concept plans, we thought it was important to really kind of provide a little bit more context and kind of fill out the full scope here. And building on some of the comments that Luke had made in the introduction, wanted to take a minute and talk about workforce housing, affordable housing, and all these terms that you hear, attainable housing. There is, I know it's small print, so there are some handouts if folks would like to kind of reference the table that's on the screen here. But essentially, big picture, how affordable housing or workforce housing works is everything is based on area median income, AMI, which has already been said a couple times tonight. So basically, area median income looks at a region. It's published annually by HUD at a federal level, and it kind of establishes the median income level for an area like South Kingstown. And then what it does is it tiers off of that. So if you're making exactly the household income at the median for a household of 2 or 4 or 5 or 3, you're at 100% of AMI. So your household is earning 100% of that median income. And the way a lot of affordable housing or workforce housing works is it really tiers off of that and says, to the point made earlier, some of the very low income tends to be down in the 30% of area median income. So households earning 30% of what the midpoint would be. In this workforce bracket, we're typically talking about something between 60% and 120%. And so for reference here, and I'll point to a couple numbers in a second, but for reference here, the median income, 100% for a household of 2 is just about $85,000, and for a 3-person household, about $95,000. So these are clearly folks working, earning money, and this is kind of that bracket that we're talking about. It tiers off of this. Where the disconnect comes in and why sometimes there are programs and public-private partnerships and tax credits and all these things that come into play is if you look, you start to see a disconnect between housing prices or rental prices and those median income numbers. For example, right now, based on a 2023 study, the median single-family home price in South Kingstown is about $580,000, meaning a household, per the kind of math of it, would have to make somewhere in the range of about $170,000 a year to be able to afford that median-priced home. And if you look again at 100% of the median income, the top for a 5-person household is about $115,000. So there's a disconnect clearly between sort of where the market is and where folks' income lines up to housing options. And that's where this sort of missing middle comes in, and these different tiers come in of saying, in some cases, they will be income restricted, where the deed, recorded would say a household has to make less than 80% of the median income to buy this home, and that home is priced or rented at X, and it's really kind of based on these charts. Where in other cases, it'll be 120% or 60%, and that's kind of part of this process, is to start to figure out what is the right mix, what is the right level of housing to be able to produce that really helps meet the needs of the community. And I want to also mention, to go back to an item that Jeremy had mentioned, sometimes there is no sort of hard recorded deed that says this house is for someone or a household making X percent. And it's more about a strategy that says it's attainable housing, meaning you might have higher density, you might have more sort of shared costs where you allow the overall pricing to start to creep down a little bit because of, like, the project he mentioned in East Greenwich. I believe it's 14 units on an acre, which is probably too dense for what we're talking here, but led to the fact that you have, from a delivery perspective, construction costs, design costs, land costs, all that start to kind of get pulled down. It's a little easier to build housing at a certain price point. It makes it more attainable without getting into kind of hard restrictions that are based on AMI tables, et cetera. So I know there's a lot, and I'm certainly doubting people came here tonight to hear somebody lecture about median incomes, but again, want to sort of paint the picture, and what we're talking about is really that workforce bracket of folks. Like, we have a couple of examples here, and they happen to be sort of public side employees, but I think it applies as well to private. We just had good data on public side. But for reference, a starting teacher in town, starting paramedic, starting police officer make less than $56,000 a year. And if you start to apply that to the table, it says, wow, it's really hard to kind of get into market level housing. Are there some of these brackets, the 80, 100, that could start to make it attainable for a household to be able to buy? And even on the higher end, a teacher in town with a PhD at kind of the highest level is about $106,000 per year. And if you think about it, if they have a household of 2, they're just slightly above the 120% bracket. If there's a household of 3 or 4, they're kind of right in that midpoint. So hopefully that helps provide some context for what we're speaking about when we talk about workforce in the middle, and kind of the need that's out there. And so at even a larger sort of contextual point, what we want to keep in mind, and I always get the less fun aspect of, I don't get to show the nice pictures and the kind of exciting stuff, but the broad picture here too, some things to keep in mind are, as we look at these sites, and maybe less or so on the current site, but certainly with some of the schools, there's a certain amount of infrastructure, demolition, sort of getting ready for building just the vertical housing product. And so sometimes those semi-fixed costs of producing something, a development, really get spread around if you have more density. The approach helps impact things like what are the property taxes going forward for years and years. Depending on how much restriction there is or how much non-restriction there is, you could see that it would kind of change the amount of taxes coming in. Also, for some in the room, it might be about, how do we maximize dollars coming back to the town potentially for someone purchasing or long-term leasing or whatever it may be, these properties to develop them. Obviously, that would play a role too, and once we start to put all these contextual points in, more units, less income restricted, maybe potential higher coming back to the town, but all these things really we want to look at as how do we balance all the various needs of people in the community and leadership and figure out what the right approach would be.
All right, everybody still with us? All right. So we're going to get through 4 concepts here real quick, and then we'll open it up for conversation, for questions, discussion. But let me try to get through the 4 schemes. We'll be able to still call them up, and we'll recount the kind of things that we want to make sure we're discussing with you all. So this is the parcel. This is the Oliver Watson house. Can I borrow your pointer? Shoot myself in the eye first. There it is. All right, red boundary is the property line. Waits Corner Road is here, the church right across the street. This is the home itself. And then these are the 2 sort of outbuildings. This one's like I don't even know what it is. It's like a little concrete block shed. Maybe they were smoking meats in it. I have no idea what they did in that one. What was it? Pump house. Thank you. And then this looks like more of a barn structure, just sort of a wooden, but again, it's in pretty tough shape, lots of holes in the roof. But technically there are the 3 structures on the property, the house and the 2 outbuildings that are here. The total property is 2.7 acres. So the first scheme we looked at, which is probably the one that's probably the least feasible if your primary objective is workforce housing, would be to simply subdivide the lot into a series of 20,000 square foot lots. The magic of that is everything around this lot is zoned R20, which suggests a minimum of a 20,000 square foot lot. And you can kind of see the sort of the configuration, shape, and size of the homes around the corner on Fairgrounds. If you were to try to replicate a pattern that's similar, and one thing we did here is we kept the existing house but put it on its own lot, it's conceivable you could get 5 lots out here, one of which has the existing house on it, in a sort of format that would be very much like what the surrounding neighbors are like. A lot to like about that. It should fit right in, feel like it's no different than what's already there. Again, the challenge with this is that the cost of these is going to be very high. Trying to sort of bridge the delta between what the construction cost is and what the sale price would be, assuming you're trying to sell it to someone in that one of those workforce brackets, that's a huge delta to try to make up for. So it is something to consider. Again, this seems like a nice, easy way of considering it, but it probably isn't ultimately the right solution if you're trying to tackle workforce housing as the objective. But we thought it was important to show this, to study this, to understand what it might look like so that it's on the table. The next option looks at taking advantage, I mentioned that cottage court ordinance earlier, and this is effectively what that sort of envisions. The idea here, and I've included a few pictures of projects we've done, is you have a series of smaller cottages. These are single-family detached homes that are fronting onto a shared common green space. So this is like a little public lawn that they all utilize. The parking is then tucked on the backside. One of the benefits of this lawn is that can be the septic area. So it's one thing we have to address here is this is an on-town sewer, so we're going to have to come up and use a septic system to address that need. But the idea is we could potentially do, say, 14 new cottages and keep the existing home, gets fixed up, becomes part of the community. You'll see in every scheme that we assume the house was staying. I don't know if ultimately that's what's going to make sense. It really is when you're in there, you can tell it was used as a series of smaller rooms for folks that were older. It's not really sort of in the best shape for being a single family home, but it's possible we could find somebody that's willing to do that conversion. So one option here is that it just becomes part of that community, right? It's one of the anchors, one of the corners out on the street, but they also participate in the sort of use and feeling like they're part of that community that's there. So this is 15 units. We've got the parking that would be required for those off the back. We might have a little spot like a gazebo those residents would use. But one thing I think about this is even from Waits Corner Road, as you're driving up and down, there's the existing neighbor on this side. Maybe there's one or two as a duplex that would just feel like a single family home out on the street, the existing house itself. So in some ways, a lot of the quote density is actually tucked back off of Waits Corner Road. So I think the pattern from the street still feels like what you'd expect a single family home every so often going down the road. And it isn't until you sort of turn off the street and walk back into the lot that you start to discover there's more to it. Again, these are a couple of examples of projects we did. This is the one I shared earlier. That was the one in East Greenwich. This is a project out on the Cape. This is a project up in Concord, Massachusetts. And these are varying sizes. This is an 800 square foot cottage. This is a 1,600 square foot cottage. So there's options for what those might be, again, depending on what you're trying to achieve, who you think the market is. The smaller the cottage, the lower the price comes down. So these are all things that we would need to resolve. But it's just, again, to give you a sense of what might fit there. A variation on that theme could be to say, let's actually just split the existing house off on its own 20,000 square foot lot. Maybe this is the first thing the town does, and they find someone to buy that house and fix it up on their own, but utilize the remainder of the property to still do a different variation on a cottage court. So again, a couple units up on Waits Corner, but most of the homes tucked a little bit further into the lot. Still a common green space that also does double duty as the septic treatment area. And again, in this case, we have all the sort of parking consolidated at the back of the site. That's the same way these operate typically. So this project here, you can't see the parking. It's all a little bit further up the way. Folks come home, park, walk through this lovely green space to get to their home. And that's what they're looking for, is that sense of community. So again, very similar. I think this one was 15 cottages plus the existing home. So we're looking at something like 16 units overall on the property. For the last option, we tried to do something that's a little bit different. We said, what if we carved off a whole acre for the existing home, including the existing outbuildings that are there? Again, the theory there would probably be to find somebody else to take that on, to make that their home, and use the balance of the site, but to use a slightly different approach. Maybe there's a couple of cottages still up front, but as you get further back into the site, utilize the type that I pointed out earlier in the Pineview example. Here's one that we did on the Cape, and here are two examples that are actually in Kingstown. These are right on South Road, right as you're getting into town. These would be two buildings that might have 6 smaller units in them. Sometimes we call them a manor house, and that's exactly what these are. You drive by this and you assume that's just somebody's single-family home. The reality is you go in that front door, there's a unit on the left, on the right, there's a stair that goes up left and right, stair that goes up a unit on the left and the right. So again, it's a way of actually doing what is technically an apartment building, but at the scale of a single family home. So again, you're able to achieve something that walking by looks like there's 6 homes on the site, but in reality there might be more like 16 units. Now some of these are going to be smaller units than in the cottages, but again, depending on what we think the real need is here, that is an opportunity to get some units that are maybe 1 or 2 bedroom units that there typically aren't a lot of, especially in this part of town. Again, we would have this is in this case the septic shown as sort of a lawn in the back that maybe the residents can use. Otherwise, there's just a pedestrian way through the middle similar to those cottage courts that lead you out to Waits Corner Road. Some of the parking for the cottages up by the cottages and some of the parking for the manor houses back further in towards the manor houses. So again, these were just meant to be some quick ideas. And my intention with these when I first drew them wasn't to have them all be sort of the same unit count. The first one was 5, the remainder were something like 15, 16 units. But that's just kind of how it ended up working out. And again, I think that's a kind of density where you could start to imagine maybe there's an approach where 12 of those get sold off as market rate, 4 of those are somehow worked out so they could be workforce housing, or maybe all of them end up being workforce housing. But again, the idea here was just to show a range of options and variations on the theme. And so that's what we wanted to talk through. As a reminder, these are a lot of the things that are still outstanding questions for rent, for sale. Is this the right number of units? What do we do with the land that we'd welcome your feedback on? And I also have this slide that has all 4 of them up at once so you can kind of cross-compare and reference things. But this is where I'd be happy to open it up for questions and comment. We do need to come around with a microphone because it is being recorded and broadcast. So if you just raise your hand, maybe Luke and Brian will come around. So we'll bring a mic to you. We'll do our best. Just raise your hand. We might try to identify a few people, but again, we've got plenty of time for conversation, plenty of time for discussion. Football game's not till 8:20, so we got a little ways to go there. But again, please ask away. What's that? Oh, and tennis is on at 7. Maybe we could flip one of these TVs over. I can do that. Yeah. So just raise your hand if you've got a question. We'll send one of these guys your way. Maybe we'll come to you next, but we'll start here.
My name is Mary Mook. You keep saying, I live on Fairgrounds Road, and my yard would abut this property. It does abut. I've lived there for 38 years, and the thought of having, as much as I totally agree we need better housing, but to have a parking lot in my backyard that I've had woods is not acceptable in any sense of it's not acceptable for me. My question isn't this zoned R20? If you do this, the zoning's changed, correct?
Currently, the zoning is government institutional. So it's currently basically a town-owned parcel with this very nebulous...
So you can do whatever, because 5 years ago, they tried to change the zoning and it didn't work.
And it didn't go through.
So you're saying you can just bypass all of that?
You can't bypass all of that, but whatever we come up with would inform the process. In other words, the town might rezone it in advance of putting it out on RFP, or it could go through a process where you use any number of these other strategies to try to do it. So that, yeah.
If you would do this, I know that's a long way off, what kind of buffer would you do for those of us who, like there's 2 new houses that are on Fairgrounds Road, and these are young couples, they happen to be policemen too, and with little kids, and they can't be here tonight because they're working, but they moved in for the rural aspect of our town, and to think that they're going to have a parking lot pretty much in their backyard is, how's the cost of their house, the resale value. It's a few of them are a little bit disturbing, I would say.
Yeah.
Or concerning. So what kind of buffer would you provide for if this ever happened?
Yeah.
For those of us who have lived there for years?
Yeah, I think those are the exact kind of details that would want to be worked out, talked through, understood. I mean, I think there's certainly a strategy where your landscaping and fencing certainly provides a level of privacy. There could be a conversation about would you rather have the parking there or the homes there with the parking a little bit further off. We usually find it's less obnoxious if you think the parking is on the other side of the fence. But the buffers are kind of to be worked out. I mean, I think one of the interesting things to consider here is if somebody private owned this property, they could do whatever they could within the realm of the requirements of zoning.
Yeah.
But if they did that comprehensive plan permit process, currently the town is short of their affordable housing requirements.
Yeah.
So a private developer could come in and say, this is what I'm going to build.
Right.
So I think the good news here is there is a process here where we get this kind of input to try to make sure we're finding the balance that Eric mentioned earlier between what is appropriate, what is reasonable, what is taking advantage of the fact that there are 2.7 acres available here that the town has.
And if you did the last plan with the house still there, what would you didn't they try to sell that before? Didn't the church across the street even try to buy it, from what I know? Would you just try to sell that to an individual, the Oliver Watson house?
To be determined. I mean, that was one thing that we thought made some sense as you put it out for the public market. You could figure out how much you value it at to try to make sure someone would buy it and fix it up.
Okay.
You could set restrictions on that too. You could say you can't buy it and turn it into a casino. You'd put those kinds of rules in place.
Bed and breakfast.
Yeah.
And there was one other thing I was going to. Though the one with you mentioned the Exeter, because we go down that way. I just feel like in this area where we live, it's farmland, it's everything. To have 3-4-story apartments pretty much would be totally inappropriate for the feel of the neighborhood.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think we would not do anything more than 3 stories, and often I'll go back even when we do 3 stories in this kind of context, this idea of doing the 3rd floor as a half story, where it looks like a dormer, really does help make it feel like it fits more in. That was part of the reason we did those sort of at the back of the lot, not at the front of the lot. So the front of the lot was the 1.5 story. Those are important considerations. It's a great point. And I think it would be important to say, nothing over, 3 stories, that's not appropriate. And
one more thing, I know other people, we're water and sewer, we're not town. Does that not restrict what you can build back there?
Those
We
would
have,
have.
we have wells in our own,
Right,
our own
right.
leach
Yeah,
field.
we'd have to figure out the water. Could be a well or try to extend a water source to this point. We knew the sewer was nowhere near here, so we assumed it was going to be a septic, which is
It
why
is.
each scheme has
Yeah.
a field reserve that would hopefully, take care of that. Those are legitimate things we would need to solve for to make this work. Those are some of those costs, right, that are affiliated with the development, which is why doing it for 5 houses becomes a harder thing to imagine than doing it for 10, 15 houses.
It'd be easier to do it for less, wouldn't it be? I mean, and maybe not the cost, but certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let
Yeah.
someone else answer.
Okay, lots of great questions. Who's next? We'll come over here. Show a hand if you want Brian to head your way for the question that follows.
I had a simple question to start, which was, can you make this available online?
Yes, absolutely. You want to address that, Luke?
Yeah, so planning has already created a website. Thank you, Jay, for setting that up. The presentations that we've shown already are up on that site in addition to links to the video, correct? And this will be in addition to that. After tonight, we'll have the link to the video and the presentation.
I know a lot more to talk about than you have time for right now, but to answer your question, about 9 years ago, there was a requirement that Union Fire get water in for their sprinkler system, which they have failed to do, which meant that the road had to be dug up, at which time the sewer would be extended from Blackbird Street. That has not been done, and that mandate has not been followed through with. So some of these issues about water, sewer, and so forth would actually be covered by doing what the town is supposed to do with Union Fire. Secondly, there are a lot of open cesspools on this site, so there's a basic problem of using the land for many things because the water table's polluted.
All of those environmental considerations are things that would have to get addressed and solved for. And if it proves out it's not feasible, it's not feasible. But the assumption at this point is that there is a way forward. What would it be if that were the case? And again, I do also want to point out this is one of 3 sites being considered. There's nothing to say that this will ultimately go down this road, but we are investigating that
What is
option.
the deficit for low-cost family housing that you're trying to fill for the town? And you're talking about 15% of 20 units, so you're talking roughly 3 units, basically, to address what's the deficit number now?
So it won't necessarily be 15%. That's all to be determined. It could be 100% of these, depending on how it gets financed and what the determination is. But currently, the town is at basically 5%. They need to be at 10%. That delta, I think we determined the other day, was something like 500 units, ballpark.
So you're talking to us about 20 units here when you have a deficit that's 20 times that.
Exactly, which is why we're looking at 3 sites. And we even talked the other night about what would be great is if there were 50 more sites that we could be talking about this, because it's the only way to truly get there. But you got to keep chipping away at it, or at least the town council is interested in understanding if we want to keep chipping away at it, what are the potential ways of doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
I think Brian's got somebody back there. You want to go head that way, maybe?
Hi there. My name's Liz Dyer. I live in the tiny white house that's on the left of the back parking lot, which I've been there 34 years. It's been great. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, how did you come up with the magic number of 16, 15, whatever? The second thing is, I'm not sure, is Oliver Watson a historic home or no?
As I understand it, there's no designation on it currently.
And I guess I'm struggling a little bit with why you would take a building that's going to need to be demoed. It's not been occupied since my children were very little, and other people's too. Was there any thought into just, and there probably has been, an empty acreage somewhere where you're not intruding? Because I appreciate when you say from the street it just looks like this, but I'm behind a door. I don't care about the street. And then the fourth thing is, maybe I have 5 questions. Is there a lottery for how the housing goes through? And what will happen to my property value? Because my property is nicely appraised. I'd like to know also a time frame. What's your budget? And will my property be affected? Because if it is, I'll just figure I'll actually rent an apartment next door. So I know it's a lot of questions, but it's just food for thought that I look at.
Yeah.
Because that is my side yard, my backyard, my front yard. I don't care about the street.
Yeah.
I'm glad people can walk by and see something nice, but it still feels a little heavy. It's like the Joni Mitchell paved paradise and put up a parking lot. That's what it feels like inside to me. And I also live on Block Island. We have affordable housing issues all the time. I understand resident workers, and I want to be kind, but I also want to know how my life's going to look somehow down the road. So thank you for your time, too. And will it be on a public referendum? I think that's my last question.
Jeremy, I'll try and answer those. Again, Jamie Rabbit, Planning Director. So I think with your first question, if it's a historic house, it's a house that was built in the 1800s, but it is not structured from a regulatory standpoint as a protected home. So it's not in the National Historic Register. It's not in a historic district where there's a regulatory aspect to that house. The issue with regards to a lottery, I think what we tried, both Luke, Jeremy, Eric, and I tonight, that we are learning to crawl before we walk, before we run. This is the beginning of a process. Union Studios was tasked with developing concepts that both the town council and the general public could react to. So with regards to setbacks and density, they came up with concept of what potentially could fit there so that people could react to it. So there's an option to keep the house or do something more elaborate than that. Property values. There's a lot of literature out there done by both the private sector, nonprofits, as well as universities, that affordable housing in most instances does not negatively affect the abutting property owners when it is done well at a high quality. And again, I think the town council should be commended for their efforts to date. They didn't ask staff. We have a skill set to do these sketches. They put resources together to hire appropriate professionals to begin this process. And to Jeremy's point, this is the beginning. This has to go a long way from where we are today to actually putting a shovel in the ground. So hopefully that answers a couple of your questions. And then with regards to a lottery, that is a phenomenal question. That question has come up at the prior two meetings. Would there be the ability to make sure that it's available first to South Kingstown residents or the children of South Kingstown residents? Because someone's mentioned that. I have a son or daughter who did live here but no longer can afford to live here. So if you did a resident-only lottery, they're not a resident anymore because they can't afford to live here, but they were. So there's a lot of dynamics and discussions that need to occur to find the most appropriate way to fit a designated need that we're trying to solve. So.
And I did want to address two quick things. One, a comment was made about the house. I've been in the house. We've gone through it with the facilities director. Surprisingly, the town has actually maintained it pretty well on the interior. It's been weatherproofed. We check on it. So I believe, we haven't done a full structural assessment, but if we wanted to reuse it, that possibility I do think exists. It hasn't been, even though it's been sitting, it's been somewhat cared for. The house itself, the property is overgrown, and we're aware of that. On the second thing I just want to make is, and I appreciate all the great comments, as you're making that, I want to translate this into what you say and what we hear. So when we hear things like, I don't want that parking lot in my backyard, what we hear is, well, we better confer with council and say, hey, they're concerned about buffers. They're concerned about seeing the project, right? That's translated. They're concerned about the scale of the project, the height of the buildings, things like that. So it's important that you know that we're taking this in broader context, right? We're not just saying somebody doesn't want a parking lot in their backyard. We're saying, we translate that as like, you don't really want to see it, right? You don't want it to impact your quality of life, and we respect that. So as we guide council, those are considerations that we need to guide them on.
All right. Which way, Brian, you want to come up this way? And one more thing you had in there was, what was the magic of 16? There was no magic. When I first actually did this 2.7 acres, I said the cottage ordinance, you can go up to 8. That would have been like 22 units. I started drawing, I was like, 22 is kind of really wedging them in here, but this felt reasonable. But could it be 14, 12? Yeah, again, the fewer the units, the harder the margins get to be. So that was the idea. Yeah. Going back here.
In regards to the town being about 500 units short, and this is going to cover, what, 25 maybe units or so, depending on how it works out. Is the town looking at other property? We're talking about 3 vacant lots, which are all really, I would say, valuable lots to the citizens of the town, especially Wakefield, South Road, and here. We use them for parks. Many of the fields kids learn how to play soccer in, other sports, things like that. Are you guys considering other property that's owned by the town, not just vacant land? One property comes to mind. It's not town-owned, but it's West Kingston is abutted by 390 acres, state-owned. And if it's a state-mandated regulation for affordable housing, why aren't we considering that property, or why isn't the state helping out?
So I can address a little bit of that. I think the short answer is we can only control what we own, right? We're property owners like anybody else in town. We can't control what private property owners do. They can certainly come in on comp permits right now and build it out to the max under the current requirements. They can go through the planning process on the current zoning, but we don't have control over that. Even though the state may own that property, I will tell you, even dealing with the state is its own monumental task, and in some ways more difficult in many ways than private landowners, having had much experience in dealing with the state. And that's no slight on them, but they also have their own priorities maybe for that land and other. There's some that land that has restriction on it. So I will tell you, I was on the school building committee. Many of you know I serve in that capacity. While I was the chair of that, there was a lot of propensity to look at other sites. I went through extensive research into other sites that may accommodate a high school with an athletic field. And I'll give you one example. On the corner of Broad Rock Road in Saugatucket, there's a piece of property owned by URI. After I do the research, I realize it's restricted under deed, right? So that property is now off the table. So, I think the council understands that there may be other options, right, throughout the community. This is the lowest hanging fruit. This is the stuff that we control, that we can build out in a way that's collaborative and get going now. Many of these properties have already sat for 20 years plus. And I don't think, the feedback I think we're all hearing from the administration to the council as a whole is, we don't want to see them sit anymore. Like, at what point are you going to do something? So this may not be what everyone in this room wants, but we're at least trying to do something and move the ball forward. So I appreciate it, but that's the honest answer.
Luke, can I build on that a little bit too? Just bringing a perspective from, Jeremy and I have had the benefit of working in a lot of cities and towns and throughout New England and looking at similar, not exactly the same, but similar scenarios. And I think, there's a kind of a spectrum of what we've seen. Just bring this in again for context. That's the name of my game tonight, I guess. But, in some cities and towns, let's put it out in the market and sell. Let's say we have a town-owned parcel every year. We have a budget for it. We're maintaining it. It's becoming worse and worse because there's not capital investment happening. Let's sell it and then go to market and see what happens. The other end of that spectrum that we've seen in some of these kind of case studies is a process like this, and I think this is a great one in kind of gathering the feedback. I think it's very rare early, but sometimes we see, and I don't know where this is headed, but you see an RFP, request for proposals that go out that is very prescriptive, and it may say, we want exactly what's shown here, we want max height is X, this is exactly the income restriction or not, this is, everything has solar, everything is set back exactly here. In fact, there was a recent project in Barrington that had a very prescriptive RFP that went out to meet a need for a town-owned parcel. So somewhere in that kind of broad spectrum is how others are wrestling with this, and I think as we hear a lot of feedback, it tends to look like the opportunity is here to really kind of paint the picture that you want to see through this process and potentially be able to sort of go to market and test it out with, here's a plan that really works for that balance notion. So Again, not trying to tip anything in any direction, just a little perspective from how others are dealing with very similar issues.
Margaret Tuoni, I live across the street on the corner. We're talking buildings. I'd like to know how many people are we expecting in this area? Because my grandsons go to West Kingston Elementary, and both of them their classes are almost at max. So if you're talking a large influx of families, kids, what does that do to the school, you know? How many people are we talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, to be determined, but.
Options, you know? Are you talking 100 neighbors? Are you talking?
No, I wouldn't expect it to be that, but I think, it is one of the things, if it's 15 homes and we'll average 2-3 people a home, you're talking about 30, 40 people potentially, if that's the way it goes. Again, some of this is, are they 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom? Some of that is still to be worked out. What's the real need there? I do know the schools is always a sensitive issue.
Yeah.
This is one community that I've heard the schools are shrinking, and it's a real concern. So in a local dynamic, it might be a problem. There's a reason the other two sites are elementary schools that have closed down. So it is something that the community definitely needs to find some balance for, but it could be that this is only, deed restricted for 55 plus. But again, I think this town in particular has suffered from doing that for so long that you've kind of gotten to a point where your schools are so shrunken, and you're having a hard time keeping younger families to stick around. So it's a sensitive subject, but it's one of those impacts that would need to be vetted, understood, planned for, addressed, and, something put in place, not just a surprise at the 12th hour.
So, and I think that you mentioned, not having URI students. Well, we're so close to URI, and, I don't want URI students moving in and out across the street from me, because
So, Jeremy,
How
I
do
can
we
touch on
restrict
that, and that's come up both at South Road and Wakefield, and it's difficult to restrict who ultimately lives there as a renter, but on the affordable units, there's a qualification process. Students typically cannot qualify under the wage incomes associated with the rental units, because most students, at least up until maybe their junior, senior year, are still claimed on their parents' income taxes. Therefore, they don't have the income qualifications to be vetted as a potential renter. And one of the points Luke made is that this is a process that the town's involved in. So the town has the ability to create criteria, even if they hold rent or ultimately put this property out for someone to build it, that they can develop the framework of who lives here. To some extent, you do have fair housing acts. We can't violate federal or state law. So if a student happens to qualify on the income side, you can't say, well, you're a student at URI, therefore I won't rent to you. But there can be components associated with this, that this doesn't become your typical 4 or 5 person rental for college students who are attending the university. So there are parameters that potentially can be built into a system, but that system has yet to be developed. Again, we're learning to walk, crawl, walk, and then potentially run, and we're at the beginning of this.
the one thing I do like about all the plans is that the existing house stays. Because
If,
I like that one aspect of the plan is that the existing house stays.
What-
Because it's a beautiful house.
And that's one thing we assumed would be the case, but I'm just curious, show of hands, who thinks that the existing house is important to keep versus who thinks it's so old and in tough, let's start there. The alternative will be, it looks like it's in pretty tough shape, maybe we should move on from it. Anybody feel strongly that way either? I'm not seeing a lot of hands either way, which is useful. One of the things we were contending with on the other two sites that have the old schools, there's a lot of sort of sympathy and sentiment around those schools, but the reality is converting those to housing just is not feasible. So the likelihood there is that those schools will come down. This is a different scenario. Here we felt like it feels reasonable until more studies are done and understand whether or not that is in fact the case. But I see that being a great candidate for sell it to somebody for very little money. They put in the sweat equity, fix it up over 10 years and live there for 30, right? But
Yard, it's,
yeah, thank you. All right, let's go back.
Stephen Rogers. I live in town. I want to thank the planning department and the town council for hiring Union Studio to make these studies and do this presentation. We have 3 properties here that are kind of in public trust, and we're about to say maybe they're no longer in public trust. I live in town, so I missed the first 2 meetings for the schools. I understand exactly where you're coming from, kind of this need for housing. We are losing population. People can't live here. We need to address it. But I also understand your concern and others who live near these properties and how will it affect them. My concern is you are showing us some nice conceptual plans, which the town asked you to do. If this properties are sold off with no deed restrictions, how does the town kind of control what happens on these? And I know you can't answer that question directly, but it's really important. You started to address that earlier, that if you restrict it too much, you're not going to find a developer for this. But I would recommend, at least for some of these properties, that the town retains a land lease on these properties or a long-term lease on them. Because once we lose public property, it's gone. It's not coming back. And it's especially, it's here, and I think even it's every property. But the schools in town, especially both of those schools, and I'm sorry, I'm going back because I wasn't at those meetings. Those are seen as public properties. They're used publicly. So when this starts to develop privately, you're taking something from the town. I know that we need housing, and it's a big dilemma that the town is facing. So I appreciate your study here. I'd like to hear more from the town, and I know Jamie, you probably can't answer. I know you can't answer this now, but I strongly urge council to think about what we're giving up if these properties are sold, and I'll end there.
No, I think it's a good question that will be vetted as the process moves forward. And I think we are in a unique situation because we're not reacting to the private sector who owns a piece of land, who is proposing a project where we have no architectural standards, no density standards, and the law in Rhode Island is set up to allow a developer using the comprehensive permit process to circumvent local zoning. Where we do have this unique opportunity utilizing the town council to develop scenarios where if you see the pretty picture and that's what the town council ultimately wants to deliver as a product, they can structure any transaction to make sure that the product that they're showing is the product that gets delivered. And a lot of times we see what's called the bait and switch on the private side, where the developer shows you the pretty picture with all the architectural detail, and then when it's ultimately construction, it gets valued engineered and all the wonderful architectural detail gets removed. Now, all of that needs to be vetted and figured out, and Eric touched upon the funding gaps. The more detail you have on an architectural standpoint, the more expensive the build is. So you will have a funding gap between the cost of construction and the cost to deliver that product to the market and ultimately what you can sell it for. And that's where state and federal funding will need to come in to, find that funding gap. The bigger we get, the more funding we get, the more capable we are to deliver a high-quality product.
Jeremy, we got one over here.
We'll do one there, then we'll come over here, and then we'll go right here. So there's the next
Thank
three.
you. I'm Joe Murphy. What seems to make sense to me, given the area of the town it is, and the fact that we don't have infrastructure and the potential impacts to groundwater, would be an option with maybe 4 or 5 manor homes with maybe in the range of maybe 4,000 square foot per house. You could get maybe 4 units in each one, with primarily 1 bedrooms and maybe some 2 bedrooms. By doing that, you could still get the 15, 16 units, but you would only have a total of maybe 20 bedrooms, which is a lot less impact than single-family houses where you'd probably be in the 40 range. And if you kept them in the 4,000 square foot, you could make that, we could have architectural standards, make them look like older, well-maintained homes, maybe cluster them, kind of a combination, cluster them where it's a little bit of a community to it, and save the housing options with more bedrooms to the other areas of town where there's more infrastructure. So manor homes, architectural standards, small units, and then save the larger number of bedrooms to other areas of the town where there's infrastructure.
I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, too. One of the big challenges here, previous meeting I said, there's a demand for everything here, and then Eric always goes, whoa, you do the studies and you figure out what you actually need here. But it is one thing we haven't done an in-depth study here, is what is the biggest need? Maybe it is 1-bedroom units, and that's really what we should be focusing on. That's why we've been trying to explore things that sort of show a range between all of those things. Where I sit, it seems like the issue's the whole spectrum, right? 1-bedroom homes aren't going to help a young family. So how do you counterbalance that? I think your point's a good one. If you think of it in the totality of all 3 sites, maybe, family housing goes more on some of the other properties. This is a better site for some smaller units that could be a little more compactly done. So a good point. Over here.
My name is Susan Axelrod. I have a question and I also have a comment. So my first question was that the land was given to the town in the spirit of elderly housing and elderly services. And I wonder if you were tasked or if you considered any sort of housing option that would be a collaborative elderly setup, or some kind of housing that would fill the spirit of that donation to the town, and whether that was part of this conversation at all.
Not specifically, but I think it's a nice way of thinking about it. Like, it's one of the questions is senior housing, and I'm sure it is one of the many needs that's here.
Yeah.
And is this a good location for it because of that history?
And I can't speak for anyone else here, but 55 plus is not senior housing. I'm not feeling very senior.
I hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my comment is that I understand how comprehensive permits work in this town, where we give denser development with 25% affordable housing. And we give market rate at 75% to offset the cost of infrastructure and land. But I hope that with free land, which essentially is what this is, that the town would not consider giving up so much of that affordability. I don't think a comprehensive permit would be appropriate for land that didn't come with that high cost. So I hope that I'm making that comment public because, but to do this as a comprehensive permit where we give a developer 75% market rate for this development is, I think, unacceptable. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll just go right here.
So
then who else has a question? Back corner, we'll come to you next.
So Taylor Rellis from Waste Corner Road, further down the block. Lived there 39 years. There's so much to be said, here, and there is housing needs of all types within our community. We have 2 homeless shelters. We have, in our community, we have many people in our town living outside. There's over 1,000 people in the state, 1,500 living in shelters, and probably 1,000 or more living outside. So that is one aspect of the housing crisis, both in our town and our state. And like the missing middle, I understand the concept that there's not a lot of programs for people 60 to 120 AMI, but there's also extreme need that is unmet in our community for people of 60 to 0 AMI. People can't get, even if they have Section 8 vouchers, they can't find places to live. So let's not pretend that all of a sudden that there is a greater need. in a certain place and start to ignore the people with the greatest challenges facing housing in our state, which is the people with the lower incomes. Now, on the specifics of this, I do really am concerned about some of the people that spoke that live very near, and obviously buffering and landscaping is key to making a project like this, it's acceptable to neighbors that are direct neighbors. On the schools, I think for a long time our community set zoning in a way that led to the closure of our schools, the graying of our community, and now even sort of gentrification, the short-term rentals. So much of our percentage of our rental units are seasonal, both for students and summer. We definitely need year-round rentals that are affordable in our town. That's a huge need. There's also a need for home ownership in the people from 80% AMI. I personally think that when it comes to projects that are using public land and public resources, it should be focused on the people with greatest need, meaning 80% and less, 60% and less, and not use public subsidy and public land for the higher end, even though there's a need there, and I understand that. But we have limited resources, limited land. Let's focus on the greatest need when we have the opportunity. In terms of I think the Pine View is an example where even in Exeter, which really surprised me, because it was 100% affordable, and I do agree with the idea too, we shouldn't be using this land for market rate units. If we're going to develop it, let's try to make the best use in our community for people that need it. There's volunteer, like we've talked over the decades, volunteer firefighters are an important part of our community. Where are those young, mostly men, I think, and if there's women there, excellent. Where are they finding places to rent? Where are, they are important. All of the people working on landscape companies, all of the retail people that are in that probably 50, 60% income level, they need to live in our town too. And so we certainly can't solve all the problems on this little parcel, that's true. But let's make the most of it. I think the idea of keeping the house kind of appeals to me. I don't know how that'll be decided. I don't think giving half of the lot to that house, if it was sold as a home ownership thing, separate, really makes sense. It's giving up too much land that could be used for buffering or for additional units and making the place have a real sense of community with some community room and ways to really make it a good place for the people that are living there and for the neighbors. So I really support the idea of residential development there. I think the most impacted people, they certainly need to be listened to, and it is a great need in our community here and at the other sites. And as other people mentioned, we have to push the state. If the state has land, our elected representatives have to fight like heck to get control of land. When it comes to URI, there's been talks with URI for decades. We need our officials to really make sure that they're not continuing to use South Kingstown for their students' seasonal rental needs and then making fewer year-round rentals available that really are the texture of our community, the home ownership and year-round rentals. So I think there has to be more done in that regard. And I would just say that for decades, our town, former town manager, really fought against affordable housing. I realize that's changing, and I'm happy that there is now more attention, and the state is now putting more pressure on communities to figure out what they can do and where. And I would just say one other thing. The 10% goal was put into a state law. I personally think that, affordable housing, which, like, the main thing about it is it has a public subsidy, it has a deed restriction, and it meets people within a certain income. And the deed restriction is good because it keeps it that way going forward. And that is a good thing. We shouldn't be afraid of mentioning affordable housing because it talks about deed restrictions, and that will keep this going forward for a long period of time and not just have it one time and then, a change of use or something like that. So, I would like to also have the opportunity, if there's going to be, email comments that could be a part of the summary that you do if you're looking for those kind of things. I don't know. But thank you.
Thank you. A lot of good stuff there. And one thing I did want to just add was I agree with a lot of what you said. And one real opportunity that I'm excited about is at Champagne Heights. Part of the point of the redevelopment there was we're actually going to be adding additional units there because they have a huge waiting list of folks, to your point, that are in that range that still have the need, right? So it's a good point. So, all right.
Good evening. I'm Rich Marcy. I'm part of the Habitat for Humanity South County organization on the board of directors. I just want to make a comment about the comprehensive permits because they are vital to organizations like Habitat for Humanity who are allowed to build homes with a higher density, not for profit, but for homeowners who can afford them. We're building a community right now in Hopkinton, 7 homes, and the first 3 houses that we sold had mortgages of $150,000. These homes are net zero ready homes, solar panels on the roof. The homeowners have virtually minimal or no operating cost to run the houses. And I invite any of you to come and see that community because it is, in my opinion, a model community for affordable homes in that nature. I think one thing, another gentleman made a comment about keeping the land and leasing it. I think that's a perfect way for the town to maintain a level of control about what happens in those properties. And if you deed restrict them, you have the opportunity to put homeowners in them versus renters in them. We deed restrict all of our properties, and the homeowners are required to live in the homes. And if they choose to leave the home, Habitat for Humanity has the option to buy the home back first, rehab it, and put it back on the market. So I think there's perfect opportunity with this land as well as the other 2 properties that the town has to collaborate with an organization like Habitat for Humanity, who's not in it for the profit. They're in it to make people who live in this community and other communities, or live in this community and work in other communities, have the opportunity to buy a home with the income levels that meet those AMI standards.
Great, thank you. I wish we had like 4 times the amount of Habitat for Humanity. It's amazing organization. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Heather Hanjack. I live at 450 Fairgrounds, so I bought that property. I just recently bought this house within the last year, so it's kind of a lot to digest for me. I grew up in this town. It took me 2 years to be able to afford that home, so I totally get the affordable housing piece of that. And I am also one with very young children, and I guess for me, right, we talk about like the aesthetic and all of that, but it's just like, we think about the zoning and the type of homes that are in that area, just some concerns, I guess, for me are just like, the noise, and I know for the traffic, that Waits Corner stop sign doesn't exist to like 90% of people that come down our road. And so just like bringing more cars and traffic into that area, I'd hope that neighbors would stop. But, you know, it's just kind of concerning for our children that are on that corner, and just speaking for the homes that are next to me that aren't able to be here tonight. Just some things in our area.
Great. I couldn't help but think we should be calling it Don't Waits Corner if people just go right through the stop sign. But I think that's the kind of example of the traffic impacts. Maybe something else should be done there, or maybe there should be additional enforcement. Those are the kind of mitigations and things that would be considered. But I think all of your points are fair points. Those are all legitimate concerns for a neighbor. Okay. I think we're going to come over this way.
So I really wanted to just piggyback on what the gentleman was saying up in front about the need for housing here for a lower income group of people. I may be one of them. And the 55 and over, I don't think it works here. We've had that done in several different places, and it took a long time for them to be able to fill those units. I also heard you say that in Champaign Heights, their plan is to add more units. We don't want the stigma anymore. We want the town of South Kingstown to build houses that are affordable for all, and for us to be able to live amongst the people in our community and not feel stigmatized because we don't have that medium income, that school teachers that you allude to, police officers that you allude to. So then that makes us not qualify for these homes that are going to go up in this community, and it drives us out. We don't want to be driven out of here. We have a land acknowledgement here that acknowledges us, this land, as land that belonged to the Native American people. There's still a lot of us here. A lot of us are homeless. We are living with other family members. We are living in apartments that are too small for our family size. We need a solution. And our solution should be that we should be able to live in our community amongst the people in our community and look just like them.
Thank you. Who's next? Anybody else have any questions or thoughts they want to share? We're starting to look at our watch and how close the football game's getting right now. I'm just kidding. Up front, let's go. I'm here all night if you guys want to keep talking. I'm good.
Hi, my name is Christine Ellis, and I live down Waits Corner Road. We've been there about 40 years. I also was on the Oliver Watson Home Committee when it was functioning with the town, and was the chairperson when the town decided to close it. It was given to the town in that spirit, not just for the aged, but for residents, older residents of that area who couldn't afford to live in that area in 1939 to have a place to live. So I'm somewhat outraged that it's just been left there for all these years. And I really believe that it needs to be developed for housing. It would have been nice if it could be for elderly people as it was intended, but I think any type of housing at this point would be good. It really is what the purpose of that land was for and what it should be used for. I don't like the idea of a private developer for what people have mentioned. All the units should be affordable at some point. And that should just, be something that could be worked out as far as the implications would be for the neighborhood. I was also going to say the house itself, which we put a lot of effort into back in the day, had an apartment on the second floor and housing for the residents on the first floor. So I think the town could also develop that house as an individual house or with units in it. And that's what I want to say. It really should, I feel, be, as people have said, it's a dire need and it needs to be done soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Got a hand in the back corner? Brian, want to head that way? Anybody want to be on deck? Not yet? Okay.
Hi, I'm Jay Wedgemont. I'm born and raised in South Kingstown in East Petunic, and I live in Wakefield. And I just want to thank the town for really focusing on a desperate need that so many people on so many levels in our town have been crying out for, which is affordable housing. Folks that went through the school district cannot afford to live in our town, and I'm glad that it is a priority to have public engagement about this important issue, and because everyone knows we need more affordable housing. And to be brief and to be okay with everyone's time, I just want to say and encourage the town to continue to have these meetings as we move forward, as you start setting goals and metrics of how many units we need, and to continue to take these amazing comments tonight that you've been hearing and integrate them into a comprehensive plan that is inclusive to everybody. Because folks are right. People can't afford to live here anymore, and it's time for us to change that. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for that. And I think in that vein too, I think it's worth considering that even these 3 sites should only be a little piece of the broader puzzle that you guys are trying to solve for, right? So I know there are conversations in other venues about other strategies, changing the zoning, things like the cottage ordinance. Encouraged to keep thinking about all those things, right? Because one site in one corner of the town isn't going to solve these challenges and on its own. So I encourage you guys to continue tackling that challenge. Question here in the middle.
Hi, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what he said, and you guys have been talking about, you know, the affordability and people like the kids can't, my kids can't afford to live here. And I've said in the past, I'm 61 years old and I couldn't afford to move here till I was 55 years old, and I've lived in Rhode Island my whole life. Having said that, unfortunately for South Kingstown, it's the double-edged sword. You have your great area, you have that ocean. So when you're talking about prices of housing, you have Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, they swallow these places up, paying way more than what, like when I sell real estate. So if I have a family, I'm saying, you know, you really want to look where I raised my family in Coventry. I would have loved to raise my family here. Now we're talking 30 years ago. That's not going to change. So, I mean, my point is, as much as we can talk about affordability, it's going to be a tough thing in this town because you have that ocean, and people from other states want to live here. They look at Charlestown is a great deal versus the Hamptons, okay? They swallow it up. They come here, they bags of money, they dig out of their backyard, and boom, and they're blowing away the people that are trying to do a mortgage. They just offer more in cash. So just want to throw that out there. That's not going to change. And that's a dilemma for the town.
Absolutely. No, it's a great point. And we do a lot of work out on the Cape, and it's kind of everything that's here times 2, right? It's a tough thing to solve. The exciting thing is it used to be the towns didn't want to think about this, and towns like South Kingstown are saying, we got to think about this. We got to try to...
Forcing them to.
Well, that too, but there's some carrot and some stick going on, I think, which is really useful. But you're right, and the challenge just keeps getting harder and harder, right? So, okay. Right up here.
What is the timetable for this? What is the timetable for the town for all 3 properties? Is there, what's next?
Yeah, what's next? So again, I mentioned that this is the beginning of an initial process. So again, the town council, working through the town manager's office, retain the services of Union Studios. Union Studios has developed those concepts. They'll continue to be vetted and refined. They'll make a presentation in either October or potentially early November to the council, and then we'll look for additional direction from the council. They may decide to refine plans and do more work on all 3 sites. They may choose to move one site forward quicker than 2 others, but a lot of that is yet to be determined. Again, I commend all of you for being here because you're part of the process. This isn't being done in isolation. It isn't an architect, a planner, and an engineer sitting in a town hall office room and coming up with a plan that then will ultimately develop. This is an inclusive process that ultimately will be driven by the town council, and they are the final decision maker. So stay tuned. Yeah, again, these meetings are public. The town council meetings are public. As Jeremy mentioned earlier, we have a boards and commissions meeting scheduled for September 19th, where we're looking at bringing in a good amount of our boards and commissions to weigh in on the concepts and weigh in on the workforce housing and affordability issue, so that those comments can be brought back to the council, and the council can do this in an informed manner and give us, as their staff, direction on how we move forward. So, this is the beginning, not the end.
If, Jim O'Neill, if the gentleman from Habitat for Humanity is still here, let's say we had a lot, town sewer and water, no other expenses. What could he build one of your cottages, 1,500 square foot cottages for today?
He is here. Do you want to throw a number out for what a 1,500 square foot cottage would cost?
In today's prices, the 7 homes we're building are about 12 to 1,300 square foot, 3 and 4 bedroom homes. The first 3 houses sold to the homeowners for $140,000. The cost to us was near double that. And the difference is made up through state funding, through Rhode Island Housing, and other charitable contributions that we get from both public and private sector. And I would encourage you all on November of this year, Rhode Island is having a bond referendum for $120 million for housing. And I encourage you all to vote yes for that, because that money will go to help not only the cause in this town, but the cause in all the towns in the state.
Good, thank you. I think that's also the other exciting thing about the town tackling some of these things is you guys have materials in place so that when some of these funds become available, you're like at the front of the line. So I think it's something to really think about. What's exciting about being proactive and not wait until some of those things come on board is hopefully you could be one of the first in line if that comes to fruition, if it goes towards these sorts of things. You have a follow-up question.
Well, I just wanted the gross square foot cost, and it sounds like he was net 50% of that. So I was just trying to find the gross cost to build that 1,500 or 1,000. Just use an easy number for all of us. 1,000 square foot, 2-bed. You know, what was that gross cost? Not the net of 50% off, but what was that gross cost today?
Jeremy, I think I can, yep, to Mr. Bryan's question, I think I can try and put it in a little perspective. I'm going to use the relationship of 10 homes. So if you were constructing 10 homes in the range of 1,300 square feet, nonprofits' construction costs around the country and in New England range between $200 and $250 a square foot. So if you're delivering a home that costs $260,000 to build, and we're just going to say they're selling it for half of that, or $130,000, there's a $130,000 funding gap. Multiply that times 10 homes, that's $1.3 million. That's no land cost, no infrastructure costs, no sewer, no water, no roads. That's just the construction costs. So Eric mentioned it earlier, Jeremy, anything that the council does, there will in all likelihood be a funding gap, and there are a multitude of mechanisms to fill that funding gap. State partnerships, federal funds, but all of that needs to be explored as you move forward. We'll take those 10 houses. If it cost $500,000 to bring sewer into that facility, you have to divide that cost of $500,000 divided by the 10 homes, or $50,000 a home, increases the funding gap. If you have to bring water in, that's another $500,000, increases the funding gap. So Subsidies will be needed.
Looking at today, I'm in the real estate business. Most everything is running $400 to $500 a square foot now. New, or even more if you're replacing or remodeling. It's incredible. But Habitat Humanity or this potential projects here, prevailing wage is into play here if the federal government's involved, or how could we involve more Habitat for Humanity people with better costs?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of those things need to be sorted out as we move forward, and there are a number of mechanisms to reduce that funding gap. Private-public partnerships, private nonprofit partnerships, public nonprofit partnerships, all to be sorted out.
Particular question around prevailing wage. I'm Frank Shea from Women's Development Corporation. We're a nonprofit developer. We do a lot of work, in South County. Typically, even though projects involve federal funding, they don't require prevailing wage at the level that affordable housing projects are built in Rhode Island, just to that specific question.
Back corner.
Brian wants to sit in my lap.
Make sure you're awake.
I'm Susan Marcus, and I just have two comments I want to make. One is that I like the town, appreciate the fact that the town has hired Union Studio to come up with these conceptual drawings, but it seems to me we also need to have a better understanding of who needs housing in this community. And so I would hope that the town council is also going to take a serious look at some way to understand who, you keep saying, well, we don't know whether we want 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom. Well, we better start thinking about the answer to that question. So I hope the town council will do that. I'd also like, I put this in an email to Luke, I'd also like to ask Eric to develop a model so that you could see what you could take this sheet, this sheet that he has with all these complicated numbers on it, and begin to make some options for those numbers based on what you find about who needs what. So I think both of those, all this conceptual drawing is very nice, but I'm not sure we've really answered the question of who needs what, and then how would we deal with it. Two other things I want to say is, one, I don't think we should do none of this should be market rate. If the town is giving this property, there shouldn't be any market rate of buildings at all, I think. And to Habitat and Humanities comment, I'd just like to say, maybe the town also, if we have enough units that we're building, maybe we need to talk to some manufactured housing people who would build a bunch of things off-site and deliver them here. Maybe, they can be beautiful, they can be environmentally very good. The architects are working on those things, and maybe the community really needs to get behind a couple of manufactured housing firms that would build some things for us and deliver them. So, thank you.
I could tell you wanted to address that last one. And I just wanted to also quickly note, you were pointing out if the land is free, then we should definitely not have to do market rate homes. But I think Eric would say it's way more complicated than we'd like to imagine it is. Is the town providing the land? Is the town providing the land and the infrastructure? Is the town providing the land and the infrastructure and probably the streetscape improvements that are needed? Is the town, so there's a lot of lines, there's a lot of costs that are not yet resolved or discussed that would need to be. But those are all the things that are going to influence where some of those numbers can end up. Do you want to add to that? I don't want to speak for you.
No,
sometimes I can say it stupidly, so you don't have to,
You spoke for me perfectly. I was having the same. As we sit here, we don't know if that land is free. So I think that's just one of those factors. And if we go back to sort of the notion of balance, there may be some folks in the community who say maximizing those dollars to the town are what's most important to me. So,
My point is, no matter how we decide this, it's impossible for me anyway. I mean, I was a minor in math, but I still can't take these numbers and sort of think about what this whole thing is going to cost. I'd like you to build a model that would show us what the options are, the same way Jeremy has shown us what the options are for the construction of housing. It would be really useful, it seems to me, particularly as we get closer to this, if we're going to proceed with this, to understand what those costs are. And I believe you could build a model from that based on the kinds of work that you do. You should be able to take these numbers and know those sizes and know something about, and you don't, just as Jeremy said, these aren't construction drawings. Whatever model you build doesn't need to be, this is actually what it's going to cost, but it would really help inform the town's decision-making if we could see more clearly what the implications are of the different sizes, the numbers of units, and the overall cost. That's my request.
Understood, and I think as part of our process, I think that's where we'll get once we start to really refine. Right now we could have 300 models, and I don't know if it would help the discussion, but certainly looking at very order of magnitude numbers would be part of this process going forward and saying, here's a funding gap if it's based on this AMI, rental for sale. We're going to do some of that. It's very difficult when it's a wide open spectrum because we would flood this room with variables and models, and it might be very confusing. But I understand completely and hoping we have time to do that.
Jeremy, I just wanted to answer one other question that was in there in terms of what kind of housing is needed. So one of my roles in the planning department is as a liaison to our affordable housing collaborative. And we have reached out to the state to ask that question to try and determine what that group should be working on. And the response that we've gotten back is yes. The need for housing is so dire across all segments that there really isn't a segment that we should be focusing on. So it's across the board, whether it's rentals or ownership, whether it's 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, whether it's younger families or elderly, the answer is yes. All of those gaps need to be filled.
So again, and I think that's why we were trying to start by throwing just some concepts up, just to start seeing where the lightning rods were. This one was actually harder than the other two sites. Because on the other sites, we drew a big multifamily building and everybody went, ah, right? All of it's scary, but that was really scary. And here I'm hearing equal fear about kind of every version that we've shown, but it was helpful on the other sites to be like, we get a pretty good sense we don't want to go down that path if we can avoid that at all possible. Let's try to think about these other things. Does that start to hone in a little bit on which models make sense to kind of test a little bit? So I think there's been some good suggestions tonight. Maybe this is a site for thinking about smaller units. Maybe they're targeted for an older demographic. How old? I don't want to put any labels on anything. So again, I think this is why we are having these conversations. You guys are helping us try to kind of start to hone in a little bit closer so we can give the town council some really informed thoughts, things to really consider at a more meaningful level. So, yes.
A couple of things. I wanted to follow up on Susan's comment about manufactured housing, which I don't believe is allowed in any district in the town of South Kingstown. That is an affordable housing that is not allowed. I personally think that's snobby, snob zoning. We have, I think, 2 mobile home parks, mobile home and manufactured parks in our town. The one on Tuckertown Road, I just recently found this out, the resale value of those manufactured homes is like $300,000. They don't own the land. They pay $500 a month. Don't quote me on that, but it's something around that. A ranch house, it comes in 2 pieces. They put it together. It is ready for occupancy. That's the definition of manufactured housing. So I think that whether it's here or just changing the zoning so that we allow manufactured housing, you can buy a new 3-bedroom ranch, $176,000, brand new. You know, if they could own a piece of land, how great is that? I would say also on the Habitat for Humanity, the committee meeting you had, the Affordable Housing Committee had a meeting, and they had Habitat and Women's Development Corps. I don't know the date of that, but I would encourage everyone to watch that. The Habitat for Humanity was very interesting, but the actual cost to them was high. But they have their ways, and they are able to get tax credits and things. Women's Development Corps, that sounded great, but she explained that it's only rental, so no one is ever going to own it. And then finally, and Jamie, you've said this before, this is the 3rd meeting, and I keep hearing people want to know, is it going to be housing for those of us in South Kingstown, for those who grew up in South Kingstown, for those of our children who want to come back to South Kingstown? Is there a lottery? How is this housing going to be for our town and the people who live here? And I think you really need to find an answer to that. I mean, can we legally say, nope, it's only for South Kingstown, give me your credentials? People need to know that, because the Women's Development Corps woman said that, no, they can't do that for their housing. So I don't know about Habitat. They haven't, right? They have, yeah, yeah. So that needs to be out there so people know that it may not be for people who grew up here. So if you could come up with that, I mean, I hate to put it on you or you to come up with the answer to that.
South Kingstown. You know, I mean, I just think that question of whether people's children who have had to move out of town already, will they be able to come back and live here and be a part of this housing initiative? And the reality of it is we need to make sure that this housing initiative that is coming up now is going for those people that really need the housing, because there's a lot of them out there. They're homeless, they're living double, as I said before, and they're not coming out here. And I'm going to tell you why they ain't coming out here. They're not coming out here because they feel like their voices are not going to be heard and they are not going to get what they need. I do a lot of advocacy, and I will advocate and continue to advocate for us who live on that low-income spectrum, who, you know, have been here for many years, whole families that are down to just a couple now, who would just love to do what everybody's kids would want to do, be home. This is home for many of us. But because we can't afford to live here and the housing isn't here, we have to go elsewhere.
I agree, and Ellis as well. You know, this is great, the middle, whatever you call it, but what are our real needs? What are they? And I don't think we know. I mean, maybe there are in the state, they know, or they don't know. What is it?
Well, again, as Brian said, it's kind of all up and down the spectrum is the challenge. And I think one thing, again, I think is exciting about what we're contemplating here is, there are organizations like Women's Development Corporation, and there are funds, not nearly enough, that are specifically tuned towards like that 60% and below. What there hasn't been historically a lot of is anything that tries to address that sort of 60 to 120. Collectively as a country, we are getting our heads around this a little bit better, but everyone's trying to find creative solutions. There's no easy solutions. I know in Falmouth, the town just wrote a check to a developer for $108,000 per unit to bring the cost down to the 120% level. Just wrote a check, handed over cash. Crazy talk, right? But it was one way of solving the problem. They said, let's put $1 million at that, and we got 12 more houses that are what we're trying to tackle. So people are trying to solve for this issue, and it's tough because, again, hopefully some of these the housing initiatives, some of these things that are out there are starting to try to tackle that challenge. But in the meantime, we got to keep being creative with all this stuff. So
I know Jeremy mentioned earlier he can talk for a very long time. And in respect for everybody's time, we're 5 of 8. Our program was 6 to 8 o'clock. So I'd like to maybe take one more question. And from that perspective, staff will stay here and linger for a few moments. But again, we've had very long days. We will stay. We do have the actual concept plans on 24 by 36 plans. So if you wanted to take a picture of them, we will also have this presentation on our webpage on the planning site under current projects. And again, this is the start of a discussion. The discussion will evolve over time as well as the plan. So again, I'd like to thank you for coming tonight, but we'll take maybe two more questions if they can be quick.
We're going to do here, and then we'll let Susan be last comment here.
Hi, I'm Kai. I've come to the last couple meetings. I'm the blue hat guy. I've been taking notes the whole time. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to run through them really quickly, just give my thoughts of what I've come up with, just my perspective as a human, again, a kid who grew up in this town for his whole life. So a few things. So I will say, because I know it came up, a lot of these things are like out of order from earlier and such, so bear with me. So I will say, like, kids who are like URI students who are both full-time students and can afford to live on their own, they're not dependent on their parents' taxes, etc. Those are unicorns. You're not gonna, like, I can't speak for everyone. You will of course have those families who can afford to just buy a house if that situation exists and just have their kid live there. Like that's possible for sure, but like for a kid to be able to afford, I say kid, of course, that's what I'm used to saying, but for someone to be able to be a full-time student and basically have a full-time job at the same time. Again, those are unicorns. I could be wrong, but that seems to be my experience with my peers and such. But also that I love the idea that, again, the town is taking all this into consideration because we do have a desperate need for housing in this town, and I'm going to touch on that a bit more. But also that I know that we have to take respect for neighbors into consideration, buffering, all of those things, but I also like that we have higher, maybe not high, it's not like a skyscraper or anything, but we have higher density housing in a rural area, and higher density housing in rural areas can actually, again, I'm not claiming to be an expert on topics of housing, but they can help keep areas rural because instead of having everyone having to buy a 1 acre property and say you have 14 people that takes up 14 acres, you can put them all into 1 acre, and that preserves a lot of the natural environment around it, so which I really appreciate because I love nature. Some other things about like how people in this town need housing. People everywhere need housing. People in Rhode Island need housing especially. The Rhode Island housing market is particularly awful. And when we talk about this kind of housing, I do think it is important to consider that we have people like living in homeless shelters. We have people who are in that 60% and below bracket who are they're not drug addicts. They're not like violently mentally ill. Some of them could be and they need help, etc. But these people are also working class people, and they need a place to live too. They just don't, like retail workers, for example, people who work like more bottom, restaurant workers, these kinds of people, their housing situation is not great to say the least. So for me, whatever happens, as long as there's any housing being built and it's affordable, that's a win in my book. I strive, like, if we can live in a world where it's 100% affordable housing on all of these plots of land like this one that we're talking about, that would be awesome. But if it's not, I'll begrudgingly accept it. But on that note, whatever we can get, I just appreciate that we're going through with this because, like I think that's been said, been putting our heads in the sand about this for a long time. There's been a lot of plans, and housing has not been a consideration of that. And let's see, is there anything else? I think zoning laws are definitely something to consider. Maybe there could be something to be said about changing those in the town to accommodate for a better housing situation. I'm not going to comment on that because I'm not a politician. I'm not a real estate. I don't know anything, right? But what I was going to get at is, in these like affordable housing scenarios, kind of mixed income neighborhoods where you have some of that below 60%, maybe you have a few houses like that. You have a lot of that workforce housing. It's all workforce. They're all working class, but the higher workforce housing, higher income workforce housing, because also that serves us a way to we're not isolating people into pockets, like you said about living in our community. We can live together peacefully and coexist as a community, no matter whether you make this amount of money or that much amount of money. We shouldn't gentrify every single area of every town, but that's being drastic and extreme. But
right. Thank you, Kai.
Yeah, that's all. We're going over, so I'm done.
So while we have Women's Development Corps, Habitat for Humanity, and other affordable housing initiatives here in town, I have a question. Are there any initiatives that look at not only income of folks who are eligible to own these houses, but also weighs a nest egg that they may be sitting on? It's my understanding that you could be sitting on a pot of $10 million, and as long as your last one or two 1040s don't show an income above a certain threshold, you are eligible for this housing that we're offering. And so that's concerning when we're seeing good affordable housing being taken by nefarious means. And is there a way to restrict this so that I cannot sit on a big nest egg and afford to purchase these houses that we are trying to set aside for that workforce housing? And I don't know how the state law works with that, but if I'm misunderstanding, then please correct me. But I believe that you're not looking at my secret stash of money when you're looking at who's qualified for this housing. You're only looking at my income.
Above my pay grade. Anybody you guys want to try to answer that one?
Hold on. So I'm Frank Shea again from Women's Development, and so our properties are mostly rental, as you had mentioned, and there is an asset test, so we don't see that generally happening. So people have an asset test to qualify, and the qualification is pretty intense because of the limitations that are in place there. So it's not something that we've seen in the units that we have.
Yeah, I can't comment to the explicit details because I'm not on the committee that does the homeowner review evaluations, but we have a woman banker who works with us that does that. I can tell you that we diligently do scrub the people's not only financial aptitude to own a home, but their ability to manage the money. They are required to go through financial training courses through Habitat for Humanity, and they are required to maintain a certain debt-to-equity ratio in their monthly income spending, and it is also what drives how we set the purchase price for their homes. I can tell you from my own experience, we have not yet come into somebody who's sitting on a nest egg that you describe that puts them in a situation where they are over an income level in terms of their need to buy an affordable home. But I can't speak to the explicit criteria or details because I'm not in that committee. I'm sorry.
I think Susan's just trying to figure out how much of her gold she should bury in her backyard before she can qualify to buy one of these homes. So with that, why don't we conclude? Well, again, we'll stick around for a bit. I will admit I'm a Ravens fan, so hopefully we won't be here too much longer, but I'm happy to stick around for a bit longer. Thank you guys all for coming out. Really appreciate it.